Well, hello there, my wonderful, socially isolated bread bakers. I bet 6 months ago, half of you couldn't even imagine that you'd be interested in baking your own bread. Well, I couldn't imagine that I'd be interested in homeschooling my children. Yet, here we are. So let's make the best of it. We are going to do a bread Q&A. Thank you so much to all of you who sent in your questions in advance. Because I was planning to do this Q&A live. This was going to be my first ever live YouTube broadcast, but it didn't work out due to technical difficulties, and YouTube is really short-staffed right now, so they couldn't help me deal with those difficulties. So we're doing it the normal way, the recorded way. All right, if I mispronounce your name, I apologize in advance. Here's a question from Lizzie Tish. Can you explain how to use instant yeast? Thanks. And the difference between that and dry yeast. Yes, so yeast usually gives people heebie-jeebies. They're all different types and they're not sure how they work and what they do. So there are two main types of yeast that you can purchase in a store. And also that's the two yeasts that you'll see listed in recipes. The first one is instant yeast and the second one is active dry. Most professionals bake with instant yeast, and that's because it's reliable. It's also extremely easy to use. You just throw it into your dry ingredients. If you want, you can throw it into your wet ingredients. It really doesn't matter where you put it into, it just works. Let me just make sure, yeah, audio is still good. The second type of yeast is active dry. For some reason, most home cooking, baking recipes call for active dry. I don't know why. It's a really annoying yeast because it doesn't last as long as instant. It spoils a lot faster. Other than that, they're about the same. They look about the same. They're like little powdery things. Here's an example of a powdery yeast. There we go. Actually, I pulled the wrong one. This is my favorite yeast to use, SAF instant yeast. This is what all the serious bread baking books call for. And somehow people think that if the serious bread baking books call for it, it must be difficult. No. It's actually very easy and very reliable. You put it in. You seriously take, say your recipe calls for a teaspoon of this yeast, you scoop it, you put it into your flour, stir it around, and proceed with your recipe. Very easy. The key thing is to store it in the fridge. If you store this in the fridge, it will last for several years. If you store it room temperature, who knows? So keep this in the fridge. You'll get a lot of use out of this yeast. But in case you want to put this into your wet ingredients, that works too. It all works. Now, active dry, traditionally when you see it used in recipes, people will tell you to proof it. Proofing is an annoying word, okay? Because proofing also refers to the final rise the bread does after it is shaped. That's called a proof. But activating your yeast is also called a proof. Activating your yeast is completely unnecessary, okay? You can take active dry yeast and simply throw it into your either wet ingredients or dry ingredients. If it's still functional, it'll work just fine. You don't need to activate it. But many recipes will tell you to activate it because it has a tendency to go bad so easily. Now, I actually have this feeling that it wouldn't go bad so easily if you just put it in the fridge. Unfortunately, many people don't understand that. They don't put it in the fridge and then it spoils really quickly. So if you get active dry yeast, store it in the fridge, you will have a pretty good use out of it. Probably, it's very hard to tell, but maybe at least 6 months. Not as long as instant yeast. Instant yeast can last for years, but Active dry will definitely last for many, many months. This whole proofing thing works like this. You put yeast into warm liquid, water or milk, and you need to give it some food. Without food, nothing's gonna happen. So the food can be a little flour or sugar, usually it's sugar, and then it's supposed to bubble up. But here is my issue with this whole idea of proofing yeast, is that yeast is not alive or dead. It's not yes or no. There's no one yeast, right? There is gazillion little microorganisms there, millions and millions. I don't know, maybe billions? I haven't counted. Anyway, and so you could have yeast where some of them died and some of them didn't. So your yeast might give you much slower rise than you expected just because it's old and you put in a teaspoon, but what you're really getting is the rise of half a teaspoon. So unfortunately, that whole proofing, like getting it to bubble up, is not going to tell you whether the yeast has its full potency. I mean, what are you going to do? Measure that little foam and see how foamy is it? Right? So the moral of the story is get instant dry yeast and ideally replace it every year. But I have baked with instant yeast that was in my fridge for, I think, 3 years. And it was still fine. My breads would just rise slower. Now, right now, everybody is having a very hard time buying yeast. So here are some tips on how you can try to get some. Now, the first tip is if you see SAF instant yeast. So as of last week, Whole Foods in my area had this, but people would show up to the store and ask for active dry yeast because that's the one they're familiar with. And when the Whole Foods person would give them this, they would say, no, I don't know what to do with this. That's a bummer. This is a much better yeast, much easier to use. So that's one thing you can do. Today, when I went food shopping, there was no yeast at all. But Amazon does sell it. You might just have to wait a couple of weeks to get it. And another clever thing you can do is to search on Amazon instead of this SAF red label, search for SAF gold label. Now, not as many people know about this yeast. This yeast is primarily used by professionals and it is formulated for very sweet doughs. See, sugar is hygroscopic. It absorbs water. So if you have a very sweet dough, like for brioche, some bakers prefer to use this yeast that's insanely resilient and can function in a low moisture environment. So if that sugar sucked in a lot of water, this yeast will still work. Well, this yeast can work for anything. The only thing I'd suggest, if you have a recipe that calls for regular instant yeast and you're using SAF gold label, reduce your yeast amount in half. If it was calling for 1 teaspoon of yeast, use half a teaspoon. If you can't remember how to substitute the yeasts one for another, you can certainly substitute them 1 to 1, but technically 1 teaspoon of SAF instant yeast is 1¼ teaspoons of active dry yeast. So if you just follow that little formula and you have a recipe that calls for active dry or a recipe that calls for instant, just don't worry about it. Use whichever yeast you have and proceed with your recipe and all will be good. Assuming your yeast is not totally dead. All right, one of you guys, Willem Orchid, asked about dry versus paste yeast. I'm guessing by paste yeast, you're talking about fresh yeast. And what's the difference? Is one better than the other? And when to use each? All right, so fresh yeast is insanely perishable. You have a few weeks to use it. And it is very hard to get in normal times, let alone during coronavirus times. So I have never worked with fresh yeast because I simply can't find it. And I don't see any reason to be working with fresh yeast because instant yeast works in literally everything. It's really fabulous. One yeast that, another yeast that I have never worked with is rapid rise yeast. That's usually for bread machines. I don't do bread machines. And it generally will speed up the rise, which is not at all desirable for good rustic breads. You want a very slow rise. But yeah, that's, I think, the 4 major yeast types. And a little word of warning that instant yeast usually is quite consistent, but active dry really depends on the brand. Some brands, I don't usually work with active dry that much, but I hear that some brands are a little more reliable than others. Also, some brands, if you want to do this little proof test where you like put it in water and see if it'll bubble up, if it's still doing anything, some brands will add a little bit of food for the yeast right into the yeast, so you don't have to add anything to get it to bubble up, and some brands don't. So in case you took your yeast and you put it in the water and nothing happens at all, it could be that you simply needed to add a little bit of sugar. You know, that yeast is just sitting there soaking in this tub without having anything to eat. And if it has nothing to eat, it will not grow. All right, so I think we covered this whole yeast thing pretty well. Let's move on to a question about water, also from Willem Orchid. Does using tap water versus filtered water make a difference? No. Anytime you hear about this water magic, you know, New York bagels are amazing because of New York water, and San Francisco bread is the way it is because of its water, that's complete BS, okay? Turn on the tap and use whatever water you've got. It's all fine. All right. The only thing about water, the temperature of water does matter. Yeast is very sensitive to the temperature, and so follow the directions in your recipe. If it says that it needs to be 70 degrees to 90 degrees, it really does need to be that. You can't put very hot water, very cold water in because you might kill your yeast. Next question from Verna O. Is it better to use bread flour than all-purpose flour, unbleached, with a question mark, when making breads and rolls? All right, so flour. The terms cake, pastry, bread, all-purpose, they're really wishy-washy terms that can be extremely misleading. All you need to worry about is the protein content of your flour. Bread is the highest, all-purpose is lower, but how much protein content all-purpose has really depends on the brand. For example, King Arthur unbleached all-purpose is very close to bread flour. It has a pretty high protein content of 11.7%. Versus, say, Gold Medal of Pillsbury unbleached all-purpose will have a much lower protein content. And cake flour will have the least protein content. And pastry flour is a mix of all-purpose and cake, I think. So generally for breads, you want a flour that is pretty high in protein content. But how high really depends on the bread. So it's not that bread flour is better for all bread. Not at all. In fact, most breads are made with King Arthur unbleached all-purpose. That's my go-to flour. You know, ciabatta, baguette, focaccia, pizza dough, King Arthur unbleached all-purpose works great. Now, in case you're wondering, what would happen if you were to use bread flour? Now, bread flour, because of its very high protein content, King Arthur bread flour is 12.7% protein. It will give you bigger but more uneven holes in the bread. Okay, so it has a potential to be more rubber bandy. In other words, it can develop so much gluten that your bread really doesn't stretch too well. So if you're making, say, a pizza and you use bread flour, that could mean trouble Like you might not be able to stretch it out to be thin at all, because you stretch it and it's gonna shrink right back. So I strongly suggest using the exact flour that your recipe calls for. But in case you're wondering, I use King Arthur unbleached all-purpose. All right, the next question, also from Verna. Is there a recipe for bread with whole wheat flour that isn't so heavy? I like a healthy version, but my family prefers baked goods made with white flour. All right, so my short answer to that is that you need to use the flour appropriate for that recipe. If you are using a recipe that is calling for unbleached all-purpose flour and you throw in all whole wheat, well, good luck with that. But there is a product from King Arthur called white whole wheat flour. And the white whole wheat flour is milled a lot finer. So all that bran, those tiny little pieces that you see in normal whole wheat flour are ground up to a fine, fine powder. You still get all the health benefits of them, but it is less obtrusive and tends to be less cardboardy. So can you get this flour right now with COVID-19? I have no idea. I barely got unbleached all-purpose. There were a few weeks where I was saving my flour because I couldn't find any in the store. But hopefully one day life will be back to normal, and you might be able to try that product and find that your family doesn't mind it as much. That being said, this is just speculation. I usually do not make breads which are 100% whole wheat. I do add some whole wheat flour to pretty much all my breads, but a tiny bit, about 11%. So my typical bread recipe will have 450 grams of flour, which is a pound, and 400 of them will be unbleached all-purpose, and 50 of them will be whole wheat. And I find that I get this very nice, earthy, nutty, very pleasant mellow flavor from it without any cardboardiness, and it's super light and airy bread with open crumb. All right, so that's the whole wheat flour. Next question is from DA. Hi DA. Do you have any thoughts on using 00 flour for pizza dough? So first of all, pizza is not one dish, right? There's so many different styles of pizza. Just in Italy, every region has its own pizza. Some are thinner, some are thicker, some are chewier, some are crispier. So it really depends on your recipe. Use the flour that your recipe calls for. But it's also good to know what 00 means. 00 is the grind of flour. The finer it's ground, the more zeros. So 00 is, I believe, the finest grind. And you can get 00 flour that's made for bread because it's made out of high protein flour, or you can get it that's more formulated for cake, or somewhere in the middle, which is all-purpose. So the real question is not, is 00 okay? Absolutely, 00 grind is okay. The question is, how much protein do you want your flour to have? And so as long as you get the correct 00 flour, I'm sure it makes great pizza. All right. But I don't think it's necessary for pizza. I make my pizza out of King Arthur unbleached all-purpose flour. All right, next question is from Pennytax. I have tried making several country breads. Last one was Chef John's. Yeah, I love Chef John, food wishes. No-knead country bread. Yeah, I love Chef John. I don't know if I love no-knead bread, but that's okay. I'll explain why in a minute. I always find that even though the dough rises a lot in the bowl, it tends to widen in the oven and not rise a lot. So the bread comes out like 1.5 inches tall. Yeah, that's not much. Like a wheel. Also, I find it hard to knead. And well, it's supposed to be no knead, right? And especially shape dough when it is too sticky and soft. Finally, the salting the dough before rise affects the rise. All right, so by the way, after you asked me this question, I went and I watched Chef John's no-knead country bread video so that I could try to be helpful. So I'll give you a short answer and a more longer explanation answer. The short answer is this. After he makes the dough and the dough rises for many, many hours, I don't remember, like 18 hours room temperature, he's gonna shape it. And the shaping is something in recipes, books, videos that people just kind of talk about as if this was Play-Doh. Just kind of mush it into whatever shape you want it to be. You want it to be round, just kind of mush it into a ball. Yeah, that's not how shaping works. Shaping is a crucial step, and the exact way that you shape that dough will completely determine how much it spreads, how big the holes are going to be, how much it's going to rise in the oven. So here's a shaping method that is really fabulous. This has revolutionized my bread baking. It's called a letter turn, and you probably have seen it in bread books, but if not, I'm gonna demonstrate this on a piece of paper. So you're gonna flour your work surface with tons and tons of flour. Well, I mean, not an inch of flour, but like it should be solidly covered with flour. So then you're gonna dump that soup of dough onto that surface and flour your hands and pat it flat. It should be like half an inch thick. And imagine this is your dough. And then you're gonna fold it like a letter. You're gonna take this side. If it's stuck to the counter, take a pastry scraper and unstick it. So you're gonna take this and fold this in thirds, all right? And then take this and fold this in thirds, all right? There. And then you're gonna do the same thing from the other way, the second letter turn. We're gonna take this and fold this in like that. And then you're gonna take this and fold this in like that. All right, and this little package is your bread. All right, and so this lines up all those gluten strands and gives your bread surface tension. All right, so that instead of just spilling its guts out all over your baking sheet, it actually stays more or less in this shape. After this step, some breads can be shaped further. You could definitely try to collect it and shape a ball out of it, but that's hard for me to explain with a piece of paper. But if you simply follow this double letter turn technique, your bread should stay much more together and rise more up in the oven instead of just becoming a little soup. All right, but I do have a few comments there about that bread, which might help you guys understand how bread works. Okay, so the no-knead bread became very popular because, well, hey, it's easy, right? Who wants to knead dough? You just mix it up and go away. So there are a couple of ways that bread gets its structure. It gets its holes and it doesn't taste like a brick, right? Most beginner bread bakers, including me, when I started baking bread, I was producing bricks. And so what gets you to not produce bricks eventually is learning what develops gluten. Gluten is the strength that bread needs in the oven when it rises up, to support those pulley big bubbles instead of collapsing. The first thing that gives you big bubbles is water content. The higher the water, the more gluten your bread will develop and the bigger the holes will be. Second thing is kneading. The more you knead it, fold it and wrap it around itself, the stronger the bread will be. And the next one is the length of fermentation. The longer it ferments, the stronger it will be. By the way, that letter fold that I showed you, it is a type of kneading, okay? It basically stretches the bread and aligns those gluten strands in a very organized way. All right, so what you could do is compensate. Say you're not gonna knead, all right, but you're gonna have a ton of water and a very long rise. So that's the whole idea of no-knead bread. It's skipping kneading, but cranking up the other two aspects that give you a lot of strength to your dough. And it works okay. One little trick with no-knead breads that I've learned is that if you, when your dough is made, you fold it over, you like mush it around a little bit, just stir it around to redistribute the yeast, and throw it in the fridge for like 5 days. You will get way better flavor. Your bread will also behave a lot better. It will stay in a shape a lot better because you're giving it longer fermentation. 1 day of fermentation that the original Jim Leahy's no-knead bread called for. I don't remember who made it so popular. I think Mark Bittman maybe. That 1 day is nice, but not great. But with long fermentation, the no-knead concept can really work, especially if you just throw in a tiny little bit of kneading with that latter fold. Okay, but yeah, that dough is very soupy, very wet. Another thing that I've noticed when I looked at Chef John's recipe is that it's done in cups, and that is a little bit problematic because we have no idea if what you're getting is what Chef John was getting, because flour is a powder, it's compressible. So if you did 3.5 cups of flour and he did 3.5 cups of flour, we have no idea if you're working with the same dough. But it's okay. This recipe is kind of so wishy-washy altogether that, you know, we don't know what Chef John's cup is, so I don't know how to tell you to fix it. If I knew how much flour is in his cup, I could tell you, but nobody in the United States agrees on what is a cup of flour. So it ranges all the way from 4.25 ounces for a cup all the way to 5 ounces for a cup. So a recipe given in cups is really too unpredictable. All right, so if you guys learned one thing from this video, it's that you should weigh your ingredients for baking. That's like the biggest thing you can do to improve your bread baking, but also all your baking. All right, this is probably more than you ever wanted to know about no-knead bread, right? And I think we're gonna unknead my paper so that we can go to the next question. Is my audio still going? Yeah, it's still going. All right, next question from Kim Prematic. 23 hours ago. Never mind. Kim Prematic. Hi, Kim Prematic. Thanks. I'd like to make bread, and I do have bread flour and instant yeast powder, but no dry milk. I'd love a basic recipe to serve with meals. Thanks. You don't need dry milk. So there are two major categories of bread: lean bread and enriched bread. Lean bread are things like baguette, ciabatta, basic country loaf, focaccia. Focaccia has a ton of oil on the outside, but inside the dough, focaccia is a lean bread. All right, and lean breads all have basically the same ingredients: flour, salt, yeast, water, and occasionally a little bit of sugar. But that's it. Now, the other category of bread is enriched bread. The richest of them all is brioche. That has eggs, that has milk, that has butter. Yeah, if you don't have milk, just do a lean bread. Pizza, that's the easiest lean bread you can start with. And pizza doesn't have to be a pizza. Pizza dough can be baked like naan, like a flat bread. And just Google on YouTube, type in Helen Rennie Pizza YouTube, and I have a super easy, no-knead pizza dough recipe that you can simply stretch and bake empty. Works great. Oh, since I just bashed no-knead breads and then I told you that my pizza is no-knead, I should probably explain myself. Okay, so where we left off before my camera stopped working was on no-knead pizza. You might have experienced a situation when you buy pizza dough from the store and you try to stretch it and it goes right back. And you try to stretch it and it goes right back. The more you knead the dough, the more you activate the gluten, and the more you activate the gluten, the more rubber band-like your dough behaves. So if you want to be able to stretch your pizza very thinly and have it not contract back as badly, it's probably best not to knead it too much, or maybe not knead it at all. Let's move on to Lady Zionese. Hi, Lady Zionese. Can I do a combination of baking powder and baking soda to get the effect of yeast? What are the leavening agents? Can you teach all leavening agents? Sure, let's talk about all the leavening agents. So the leavening agents you usually use in muffins and cakes and stuff like that is baking powder and baking soda. Those leavening agents are fast acting. As soon as you add them to wet ingredients, they start to fizz up, and you'd better bake them immediately or they fizz right out and they don't rise anymore. Versus yeast, is very long lasting. If you add yeast to your dough, it will still work, gosh, in a week, maybe even longer. So actually pretty sure it will still work longer if you give it new food and give it a little more starch to eat. Because bread is a fermented product, it needs to develop gluten, and develops this gluten through kneading, which takes time, and then rising, which takes even more time. We need to give it a leavener that can withstand time, and baking powder and baking soda can't. That's why you can't bake bread with them. And I know in the United States, people called certain cakes breads. Banana bread, zucchini bread, they're not breads, they're cakes. They have tons of sugar in them. That's where they get that nice tender crumb. If you were to take sugar out because you want to make a sandwich with, I don't know, turkey or something, you're gonna get a brick. So for cakes, people do use baking soda, baking powder, but for breads, people use yeast. Now, if you can't get yeast right now, then try baking tortillas. Tortillas are fabulous. They are delicious. They just need flour, lard, water, and salt. If you can't have lard, I bet you could do butter or coconut oil. I haven't tried that. I've only tried them with lard, but I bet that would work in a pinch. And that'll give you that satisfaction of making the dough and kneading it, and they're delicious. You know, they're great for sandwiches. You can even turn them into a fake pizza. Bake the tortilla, and then, not bake, cook it in a skillet, like you'd cook a tortilla, and then top it and bake like a pizza. All right, so I know this is tough right now, you guys. So, here's another idea for you about yeast. If you can't find yeast, who would have thought, right? Okay, ask around in your neighborhood. You probably have some sort of Facebook group for your neighborhood. Ask around, because somebody in your neighborhood might have yeast. People who are into bread buy yeast in huge bags. So like if somebody in my neighborhood needs a little yeast, I could totally share mine. So ask around, somebody might be able to help you out. Next question from Hangabuna Bunga. Can I freeze doughs or pizza dough? I do that, but when I bake, it's not the same as a fresh one. All right, here's what does freeze extremely well. Baked bread, already totally finished. Wrap it in plastic wrap, then put it in a Ziploc bag, put it in the freezer, works like a charm. The reason it freezes so well is because it has almost no water, or very little, by the time it's all baked. And yeast has done its job at that point. So if you kill all the yeast, well, it's already dead from the oven. What does not freeze very well is unbaked yeast dough. Now, how not well this works really depends. There's no way to predict this. I have tried freezing brioche dough once for only like maybe a week or two, and I did produce totally reasonable brioche out of it. I defrosted it in the fridge, and then for like a day, and then I shaped it and let it rise. That rise took forever. It took almost double of what it usually takes me. And then I baked it and all was good. And I'm guessing the reason that rise took so long is because some of the yeast might have died. Now remember, yeast is not all or nothing. It's not all alive or all dead. It's millions and millions of microorganisms, and some might still be alive and some not. So it's not like if you freeze your bread, boom, it will, if you freeze your dough, it will definitely not work. It's just, it might not rise quite as well. And how not as well, it's hard to tell. You know, it depends on how long you froze it for and how much yeast it had to begin with. All right, so that's the answer to the bread freezing question. We are on to page 2. And my camera is still working, audio is still working, good. Okay, this is a question from Oddspod. Hi Oddspod. What's your favorite Russian Eastern European yeast dough baked good? And would you consider making a recipe for such a thing? Yes, it's pirashki, and I have a recipe for it. Google Helen Rennie pirashki YouTube. All right. Harold Pestian. This is the Q&A of my dreams. I just can't seem to get my dinner rolls right. I use the same recipe that I do for bread. That turns out great. So I am really looking forward to this. Thanks, Helen. All right. So, yeah, that's one thing with bread. You could have fabulous dough, right? And then you give it a different shape and nothing works. And think about the dough as fabric. You know, you could have great fabric, but then you actually have to sew a dress out of that fabric, and that's shaping. And it could be that you're very good at the other shapes you do and maybe not as good at the dinner roll shapes yet. That's one possibility. And another possibility is that your dough, that fabric that you've got, just really doesn't work for that shape. Could be. So I have a video on dinner rolls called Tangyong milk bread. Tangyong is hard to spell. It's this technique of making a roux to start the dough. But if you just Google Helen Rennie milk bread rolls, you'll probably find it. And that shows how to shape dinner rolls. So the pan you're baking in will matter. How far apart you space those rolls will matter. So with bread, everything matters. So it could be just maybe get a recipe specially formulated for dinner rolls, follow all those instructions so that you can produce some dinner rolls. And then if you like your dough more and you want to adapt that to dinner roll shape, at least you've got some dinner roll experience under your belt. But you could also, if you send me the recipe you're using, once I see that, I might have more advice on what we can do to improve your dinner rolls. Oh, and also specifically, like what goes wrong? Are they too dense? Are they too dry? Are they collapsing after baking? Or what happens? Because if we have a specific problem, we can find the specific solution. All right. What else do we have? Jay. Hi, Jay. Working on making my own sourdough starter. Ah, fun. It's day 5, and according to the recipe I'm following, it should all be bubbly and sour smelling in a good way. Not a lot of bubbling and not the kind of tangy smell based on what my fermented grains for the chicken smell like I'm expecting. It is fairly cool in the kitchen at the moment when we are cooking in it, 18 to 19 Celsius, so I realize it will take longer than average, but my question is approximately how many more days should I be feeding it before I see results? Oh, sourdough starters. Okay, so you're right, the temperature of your kitchen makes a big difference. The warmer it is, the faster this happens, but there are other factors which I find sourdough recipe creators often ignore and don't tell you, and then things don't work out for you and you go, why? What did I do wrong? Okay, so the sourdough starter has to get bacteria somewhere, yeast somewhere. And people who work with breads a lot, particularly sourdough breads, in their kitchens, whether it's professional bakeries or just enthusiastic sourdough bakers at home, their air is loaded with that natural yeast. While if this is your very first sourdough starter, you don't have the microorganisms in your environment. You don't have that many of them to really get it going quickly. So it's not that they're trying to mislead you. It is very possible that that person was playing with sourdough breads for many years, and finally they perfected their sourdough starter, and they give you this recipe saying, you know, I do this. Step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and look at this, in 5 days I've got a starter. And you do that, and not much might be happening. So I feel your pain. I don't have a ton of sourdough experience. I've done that only once, and my experience was just like yours. It really left much to be desired. Now, I think if you wanted to get your feet wet with sourdough, what I would suggest doing is starting a starter and using it in your breads, but also adding some yeast, normal commercial, like man-made yeast, along with your starter. This way your starter is going and you're feeding it, and it's, you know, but it might take it a month or two to get strong enough to stand on its own. And in the meantime, you could be putting it to use making some breads, assuming you have some yeast at home, which you might not. Maybe that's why you're doing a starter. So if that's the case, I'm sorry. It is tough lately. Gosh. But yeah, it's not just you. Sourdough starters are tough. All right. I think that's all we have in terms of questions. A couple more little words of advice. Some of you guys said you are thinking of getting started with yeast doughs, but you don't know what to do, where to look. I'm just checking my audio. Yeah, it's still going. So learn to weigh your ingredients. Get a good bread baking book. One of my favorites is Rose Berenbaum. Rose Berenbaum is fantastic. She has this book called The Bread Bible. It's a great bread technique book to get you started. She explains everything in gory detail. And just practice and realize that first few times are going to be rough, but then you'll get a hang of it, and you know, you'll keep getting better with every loaf. All right. That's all I have for you for today. I'm gonna go and glue this whole video together, but I'm not gonna do much editing, unlike my usual videos, just because at the moment I'm still working on all my normal videos for you, and I'm homeschooling kids, which is, well, not as fun as bread baking, let's put it this way. Here are more thought-provoking videos for you to check out, and if you are ever in the Boston area, maybe I'll see you in one of my classes. Bye-bye!